The call came on a Tuesday, a gray, drizzly Chicago Tuesday, where the sky seemed to melt into the tops of the skyscrapers. I was neck deep in a branding project for a new line of artisanal dog food, arguing with a client over the emotional impact of the color beige, when my phone buzzed with an unknown number from a Utah area code. I almost ignored it. I wish I had. The man on the other end had a voice as dry as dust. He was a lawyer, he informed me, with zero emotion, that my grandfather, Arthur Vance, had passed away. There was a pause. I think it was meant for me to express some form of grief, but all I felt was a hollow echo. It's hard to grieve a ghost. In my 28 years, I'd met Arthur exactly twice, both times before I was old enough to form lasting memories. He was a phantom, a name attached to my mother's sad sighs and my uncle's angry rants, the family's resident madman. The lawyer cleared his throat. Mr. Vance has named you, Ms. Maya Collins, as the sole beneficiary of his estate. I almost laughed. His estate? Does that include his collection of tinfoil hats? The lawyer did not laugh. It includes a 10-acre property and the structure upon it. The deed is being sent to you. We will need you to come to Utah to sign the transfer documents. And that was it. My life, with its predictable rhythm of deadlines and takeout, was suddenly interrupted by a dead man's bizarre punchline. My mother pleaded with me not to go. Just let the state have it, honey. There's nothing for you out there but bad memories and dust. But I couldn't. It felt unfinished. I needed to see the place, the source of the myth. I needed to put the ghost to rest myself. The flight from O'Hare to Salt Lake City was like traveling between dimensions. I left a world of steel, glass, and constant noise, and arrived in a land of sharp mountains and a sky so open and empty it felt like it could swallow you whole. The rental car was a generic SUV that smelled of pine-scented air freshener. As I drove west out of the city, the world began to dissolve. Suburbs gave way to sparse ranches, which in turn gave way to absolutely nothing. The mountains flattened, the green faded to brown, and then the brown bleached to a brilliant, painful white. The Great Salt Lake Desert doesn't look like a planet on Earth. It looks like a planet that died. The highway was a black ribbon laid across a fractured, endless plain of salt. The heat shimmered off the ground, creating phantom lakes on the horizon that would vanish as I got closer. The silence pressed in on me, broken only by the hum of the tires on the asphalt. I pulled over once, just to feel it. The moment I cut the engine, the world fell away. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, full of sunlight and space. I felt utterly, completely alone. My GPS, bless its synthetic heart, eventually guided me off the highway and onto a bone-rattling dirt track. A plume of white dust, thick as cream, billowed out behind me, the only evidence I was even moving. For 20 minutes, I saw nothing, not even a bird. And then a dark shape materialized through the heat haze. A single, brutalist rectangle sitting in the absolute center of nowhere. Arthur's estate. It was a utility shed, a windowless, corrugated metal box rusting at the seams. It looked like it had been dropped from orbit. I parked the car, and the engine ticked itself cool in the oppressive silence. The sun was a hammer. Every surface shimmered. As I walked towards the shed, the salt crunched under my boots like broken glass. A massive roll-up garage door faced me, held shut by a padlock the size of my fist. The lawyer had FedExed me a single, heavy, almost medieval-looking iron key. It took all my weight to get the key to turn in the rusted lock. It finally gave way with the sound like a breaking bone. The door was next. It wasn't powered. I had to find a handhold and heave. It groaned and screeched in protest, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Inch by agonizing inch, I forced it upward. A wave of cool, dry air washed over me. It smelled ancient, like stone and ozone. As the door reached the top and locked into place, light flooded the cavernous space. The shed was starkly minimalist. To the left, a military-style cot, a small table, and a single chair. A few crates of what looked like non-perishable food were stacked neatly against the wall. To the right, however, was a sprawling workbench. It was a mad scientist's dream, covered in a chaotic but clearly functional array of custom electronics. Oscilloscopes, signal arrays, and strange copper coils were wired together, all centered around a large vintage reel-to-reel tape machine. But my eyes were drawn to the center of the concrete floor. There, perfectly aligned with the room, was a 5-by-5 foot plate of what looked like brushed steel. It was seamless with the floor, but for a thin, perfect outline and a recessed ring handle in the middle. It wasn't a patch. It was a door, a hatch, leading down. A cold dread, mixed with an electric surge of curiosity, washed over me. I walked numbly to the small table by the cot. On it was a thick, leather-bound journal. Embossed on the cover were 2 words: Arthur Vance. Lying on top of it was a sealed envelope with my name, Maya, written in a shaky but elegant script. My hands trembled as I opened it. The note inside was short. Maya, if you are reading this, I am gone. Good. My time was over. Your family thinks I was chasing shadows, perhaps. But what they never understood is that eventually, shadows turn and start chasing you. You have a choice. This is the most important choice of your life. Turn around, lock the door, get in your car and drive away. Sell this land, live your life, forget you were ever here. Or you can choose to know. The truth is not in the sky, it is under your feet. The choice is yours, and only yours. My breath caught in my throat. I looked from the note to the steel hatch. My simple, practical plan had evaporated. This wasn't an errand anymore. This was an issue. I put the note down and, with a sense of inevitability, opened the heavy journal. The first page was dated June 11th, 1983. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was clear. It consisted of a single chilling sentence. The librarian is singing again. I must answer. The words just hung there in the silent, cool air of the shed. I read them again, and a third time. It was nonsense, the kind of florid, dramatic prose you'd expect from a man who spent 40 years alone in the desert. The librarian. It was probably what he called his radio, or maybe it was a code for a foreign spy station he'd convinced himself he was monitoring. My uncle's voice echoed in my head. The man's a nutcase. I scoffed, a short, sharp sound that was immediately swallowed by the quiet. I was ready to close the journal, to declare the whole trip a colossal waste of time. And yet, my eyes drifted from the journal to the workbench, with its intricate web of wires and glowing vacuum tubes. I looked at the massive, perfectly engineered steel hatch dominating the center of the room. This wasn't the work of a casual eccentric. This was the work of a brilliant, focused, and deeply obsessed man. The question was, obsessed with what? With a sigh of resignation, I sat down in the single wooden chair, pulled it up to the table, and rested the heavy journal under the beam of light coming from the open door. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the white salt flats outside in shades of orange and pink, and casting a long, distorted shadow of me across the concrete floor. I started from the beginning. The first few dozen pages were normal, almost boring. They were geological field notes from the late 1970s. My grandfather, Arthur Vance, was a geologist for a large mining corporation. He wrote with a scientist's precision about seismic surveys, core samples, and density readings in this very area. He was searching for potash deposits. But then the tone began to change. October 1982. Ran the deep ground penetrating radar for the third time. The anomaly is still there, 300 feet down. It's not a void, not a deposit. The readings are impossible. The density is off the charts, far greater than any known element, yet the mass displacement is wrong. It's like a piece of gravity fell out of the sky and buried itself here. The company wants me to sign off, to label it an instrument error. I can't. It's real. January 1983. I quit today. They tried to transfer me to a project in Alaska. They wanted me gone. They know what's here, or at least they know enough to be terrified of it. I cashed out my pension and bought the 10 acres directly above the anomaly. They called me a fool. Let 'em. My fingers traced the faded ink. He had thrown his entire life away for an instrument error. I kept reading, flipping through pages detailing his solitary, back-breaking work. He had spent years digging. Not with heavy machinery, which would have drawn attention, but with a drill, a winch, and dynamite, sinking a narrow, reinforced shaft straight down into the salt crust. And then I found the entry I was subconsciously looking for. June 10th, 1983. I broke through. After all this time, I'm through. The chamber is pristine, not a cave. It's a perfect geode, a hollow sphere of obsidian-like crystal, and in the center, suspended in the air by a force I cannot comprehend, is the object. It's not built. It seems grown. A crystalline lattice, 12 feet in diameter, jet black and absorbing all light. It is utterly silent. And yet, there is a hum. A vibration not in the air, but in my bones, in my teeth. It is the sound of a thing that has been waiting for a very, very long time. I felt a chill crawl up my spine despite the desert heat. I looked up from the page and my gaze fell upon the reel-to-reel machine on the workbench. The tapes were carefully labeled with dates, each corresponding to a journal entry. He wasn't just observing it, he was recording it. The oscilloscopes were meant to give its voice a shape. He was trying to create a dialogue. I turned back to the journal, my skepticism warring with a growing sense of awe. A week after his initial discovery, he gave it its name. June 17th, 1983. It sings at regular intervals, a low-frequency, complex wave of sound that is inaudible but measurable. Each time it does, my mind is flooded with information. Not words, not images, raw data. Star charts, mathematical formulas, biological diagrams of creatures that could never exist on Earth. It's overwhelming, a torrent of knowledge. It is not a rock. It is a repository. It is a library. I will call it the librarian. For the next hour, I sat there, utterly mesmerized, as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the shed into twilight. I read about his decades of solitary study, his attempts to decipher the librarian's song, his growing conviction that it was a sentient archivist, a seed of knowledge sent from a long-dead civilization. And I read about his fear, his paranoia, the black unmarked cars he'd sometimes see parked on the distant highway, his belief that the government, the same people who owned the mining company he worked for, had never stopped watching this place. My pragmatic Chicago brain was screaming. It was a delusion, a magnificent, intricate 40-year delusion of a lonely, brilliant man. He found a weird rock and built a fantasy around it. But the evidence, the hatch, the custom-built machinery, the sheer unwavering focus of it all. I finally closed the journal. The last sliver of daylight was gone, and the shed was now cloaked in a profound darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the stars through the open doorway. The choice Arthur gave me in his note burned in my mind. Lock the door and drive away, or choose to know. For a long moment, I just sat there, listening to the sound of my own breathing. Driving away was the sane option. It was the rational choice. But I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that if I left now, this question mark would haunt me for the rest of my life. The ghost of my grandfather would never be put to rest. Slowly, I stood up. My legs felt stiff. I walked to the center of the room, my boots echoing in the quiet. I stood over the steel plate, the door to my grandfather's magnificent madness, or to a truth my mind couldn't yet comprehend. I knelt down, the cold metal a shock against my knees. My fingers found the recessed metal ring. It was cool and smooth. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of salt and secrets, and then, with both hands, I pulled. I pulled with everything I had. My muscles screamed, my knuckles were white against the cold metal ring. For a long second, nothing happened. The hatch was a solid piece of the earth, fused shut by time and secrets. I gritted my teeth, repositioned my feet for better leverage, and gave one last desperate heave. There was a deafening shriek of metal scraping against metal, a sound that violated the profound silence of the desert. The seal broke. The hatch, aided by a system of hidden counterweights, swung upwards with a deep, resonant thump, revealing a square of perfect, impenetrable blackness. A gust of air rushed out of the void, and it was the strangest thing I'd ever felt. It was cold, but not like the cold of a basement. It was a deep, ancient cold, the kind you feel from standing at the mouth of a cave that hasn't seen sunlight in a million years. It smelled of ozone, damped stone, and something else. A faint, clean, metallic scent, like the air after a lightning strike. I scrambled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was standing at the edge of a man-made hole that led straight down into the planet. Peering over the edge, my phone's flashlight beam was swallowed by the darkness. It couldn't find a bottom. Bolted to the side of the shaft was a narrow industrial steel ladder, its rungs descending until they were lost in the gloom. This was his dig site, the shaft from the journal, all 30 stories of it. Every rational instinct screamed at me to slam the hatch shut, get in my car, and drive until I saw the lights of a city. This was insane. This was a grave. But Arthur's words from the note, and the even more cryptic sentence from his journal, had hooked themselves into my mind. The librarian is singing. Taking a shaky breath, I sat on the edge, swung my legs over, and found the first rung of the ladder with my boot. It was solid, cold, and solid. Holding my phone in my mouth to light the way, I began to climb down. Journal entry, read in a voiceover as Maya descends. November 1984. The shaft is now at 150 feet. My calculations were correct. The salt layer is incredibly stable. I've reinforced every 10 feet with concrete and rebar. It is slow work. It is lonely work. But the hum is stronger down here. It is a constant companion. It vibrates through the rock, through the soles of my boots. Sometimes I think it speaks in a language of pure mathematics. I wake up with impossible equations scrawled in my notebooks with no memory of writing them. The descent was terrifying. The world shrank to the small, dancing circle of my light. The air grew colder and the metallic smell stronger. The only sounds were my own ragged breathing, the rhythmic clank of my boots on the steel rungs, and a new sound. Growing steadily from a faint vibration in the ladder to an audible, sub-bass hum. It was the sound from the journal, the librarian's song. It wasn't a noise that entered my ears. It was a pressure that built behind my eyes, a thrumming that resonated deep in my chest. It felt like I was climbing down for an eternity. My arms ached, my fingers were numb. Finally, my boots hit a solid surface. I was at the bottom. I swept my light around. I was in a small, man-made room about 10 feet square. The walls were a mix of exposed, dark rock and smooth, poured concrete. In one corner sat a large, silent diesel generator. In another, a series of heavy-duty batteries were wired to a control panel, explaining the power to the workshop above. This was the heart of his operation. But my attention was fixed on the wall directly in front of me. It wasn't rock. It was a heavy, circular steel door, like something you would find on a submarine or a bank vault. A large, spoked wheel was at its center. The low hum was so much stronger here, seeming to emanate directly from the other side of that door. It made the air tremble. It made my teeth ache. Scrawled across the top of the door in faded white paint was a stark warning. A message from Arthur to himself. Or maybe to me. It does not speak. It shows. Quiet your mind, or it will break it. My logical mind was a frantic mess, trying to find a rational explanation for all of this. It was a geothermal vent, an underground river, a strange magnetic deposit. But my gut, the primal part of me that had been awakened, knew better. I was standing at the threshold of the impossible. My journey had started as a simple, cynical errand. Now it had become a pilgrimage. I had to see what was behind that door. I had to know what my grandfather had died protecting. My hand, slick with nervous sweat, reached out and closed around one of the cold steel spokes of the wheel. I braced myself, the hum vibrating through my entire body, a silent chorus from the heart of the earth. The wheel turned with a slow, grinding reluctance, as if fighting against the weight of years. I put my entire body into it, my feet slipping on the smooth concrete. For a moment, it wouldn't budge, and I felt a wave of despair. Then, deep within the door, something shifted. A series of heavy, oiled tumblers began to fall into place with a cascade of thunderous clunks that echoed in the confined space. A final, satisfying click resonated through the wheel into my hands, followed by a long, soft hiss as decades of pressurized air equalized. The seal was broken. I pulled, and the massive steel door swung inward, its hinges impossibly silent. The complex hum from within washed over me, a physical wave of sound that made my hairs on my forearm stand on end. The air that flowed out was different yet again. It was utterly still, completely devoid of dust or moisture, and carried the sharp electric tang of a storm, making my teeth ache and my eyes water. The space beyond was a void. My phone's flashlight, which had seemed so powerful in the shaft, was now a pathetic little spear of light against an ocean of darkness. I stood at the threshold, my heart a frantic drum against the deep, steady pulse of the hum. Arthur's warning was a scream in my mind. Quiet your mind, or it will break it. What did that even mean? How do you quiet a mind that's spinning with terror and disbelief? Taking a breath that did nothing to calm me, I took a single, deliberate step through the doorway. I was no longer in a man-made room. I was somewhere else. I swept my light in a wide arc. The beam slid across a surface of polished, seamless black crystal. I was inside the geode from the journal. It was a perfect, colossal sphere, at least 200 feet in diameter. The walls were unnaturally smooth, and they seemed to swallow my light, reflecting nothing back. It felt less like a cave and more like the inside of a skull. The scale of it was breathtaking, impossible. One man with a winch and dynamite could not have made this. This place was ancient. And in the exact center of the immense dark sphere, it hung. The librarian. My flashlight beam found it, and my breath hitched in my chest. Arthur's description could not do it justice. It was a perfect sphere of absolute black, easily 12 feet in diameter, suspended in the dead center of the cavern with no visible means of support. It didn't float. It was simply held there, a fixed point around which the world had formed. Its surface wasn't smooth. It was an infinitely complex fractal web of crystalline structures, like a three-dimensional snowflake made of frozen lightning. It didn't reflect my light. My beam hit it and just stopped. The light vanished into its depths as if it had never been. It was the most beautiful and the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. A silent god in the heart of the world. I remembered his words. I stood there, just inside the doorway, and forced myself to calm down. I lowered my flashlight, letting the darkness mostly reclaim the chamber. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to empty my head of the frantic, panicked thoughts. I stopped trying to analyze, to rationalize. I stopped thinking and just was. I opened my eyes and looked at the black sphere, not as an object, but as a presence. I listened not with my ears, but with my mind. And it answered. There were no words. There was no sound. It was a sudden, violent, and impossibly clear stream of information injected directly into my consciousness. First, geometry. Shapes that could not exist in 3 dimensions, rotating and evolving. Then, star charts. But the constellations were alien, the perspectives galactic. I saw the birth of a sun in a nebula of purple and gold, its entire billion-year life cycle compressed into a single, brilliant second. It was overwhelming. It was like trying to drink from a fire hose. I felt a sense of immense cosmic loneliness emanating from the sphere. It was an archive, a tombstone, the last remnant of a people who were incomprehensibly ancient. I saw them, not as bodies, but as beings of pure energy, living in cities woven from light and sound on a world with a crimson sun. It was a fleeting, impossibly beautiful vision. Then, the vision soured. The song-like hum in the chamber faltered, dipping into a discordant, menacing tone. The image of the light city was suddenly invaded. Not by an army, not by ships, but a shadow. A creeping, silent wrongness that spread between the beings of light. A patch of nothing. An anti-existence that didn't destroy the light, but simply unmade it. The feeling that came with it was a pure, undiluted terror that was not my own. It was the last horrified scream of a dying starfaring race. No! The word was torn from my throat, a ragged gasp. I stumbled backward, tripping over the threshold of the door, and crashed hard against the concrete floor of the antechamber. I scrambled away, crab walking until my back hit the far wall, my eyes squeezed shut. The vision stopped. The instant I broke line of sight, the direct feed into my brain was severed. I was on my hands and knees, hyperventilating, my head feeling like it was about to split in two, and the steady, clean hum of the chamber seemed to mock me from the other side of the doorway. I wanted to know. And now, a tiny, terrifying fraction of that knowledge was tearing my mind apart. My mind was a car crash. Twisted fragments of alien thought collided with my own panicked human terror. The vision of the creeping, unmaking shadow was burned onto the inside of my eyelids. I was huddled on the cold concrete of the antechamber, my back pressed against the wall as if I could somehow push myself further away from the open door and the monstrosity it contained. Get out! The thought was a primal scream, the only coherent thing in the storm of my mind. Get out! Now! On legs that felt like jelly, I scrambled to my feet. I didn't look into the chamber again. I couldn't. I threw my shoulder against the massive circular door and pushed with a strength born of pure terror. It swung shut with a groan, cutting off the direct pressure of the hum. The world felt marginally saner. I grabbed the wheel and spun it frantically. The locking pins slammed home one by one. Clunk, clunk, clunk. Each sound a bar on a cage, locking the nightmare away. Then I turned and lunged for the ladder. The climb up was a blur of blind panic. It was the inverse of my descent. There was no curiosity, no sense of wonder, only a desperate, animal need to reach the surface. My hands were slick with sweat, my muscles screamed, but I didn't stop. I climbed, my breath coming in ragged sobs, my boots clanging a frantic rhythm on the steel rungs. The darkness below felt like a living thing, a hungry mouth that wanted to swallow me. The muffled hum seemed to chase me upwards, a reminder of the impossible truth I was trying to escape. After what felt like a lifetime, my grasping hand hit the edge of the opening. I pulled myself up, scrambling out of the shaft and onto the solid, familiar concrete of the shed floor. I lay there for a long moment, gasping, my cheek pressed against the cool, dusty ground. I was shaking uncontrollably. With the last of my strength, I crawled over to the steel hatch and heaved it shut. The boom, as it closed, echoed in the shed. A final, definitive severing. I was back in my world. The nightmare was buried again. I stumbled outside, out of the confines of the shed and into the open. The sun was long gone. The desert was bathed in the cold, ethereal light of a billion stars. The Milky Way was a brilliant, shimmering slash across the blackness, more vivid and clear than I had ever seen it. Before, I would have found it beautiful, peaceful. Now, it was terrifying. It wasn't a peaceful collection of distant suns. It was a wilderness, a dark, impossibly vast forest filled with unseen things. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that one of those pinpricks of light had been the home of the beings I had seen. And I knew that the shadow that had consumed them was still out there, drifting silently in the abyss between the stars. Was Earth shining too brightly? My entire conception of reality had been demolished in the space of an hour. I was adrift, unmoored from everything I thought was true. I needed an anchor, an interpreter. The journal. I ran back into the shed, my movements frantic. I flicked on my phone's flashlight and found the leather-bound book on the table where I had left it. It was no longer just a curiosity. It was a survival guide. He had lived with this knowledge for 40 years. How had he not gone insane? I didn't read from the beginning. I frantically flipped through the pages, searching for the entries after his first contact, looking for a reflection of my own terror. I found it in a section from the late 1980s, the handwriting more jagged, more desperate than in the earlier entries. He wrote about the same vision, the city of light, the beautiful alien race, and the encroaching void that unmade them. He had wrestled with what to call it. The journal was filled with scratched-out names, the enemy, the shadow, the hunger. But then, on a page dated May 4th, 1989, he finally found the words. The entry was short, but it sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. It is not a creature. It is not an army. It is a principle of the universe, a form of cosmic erosion. It hunts civilizations that achieve a certain level of networked consciousness. It is a filter designed to keep the universe quiet and dark. It has no name, for it is the absence of everything. So I will give it one. I call it the Great Silence. The Great Silence. The name settled into my mind like a layer of frost. It was perfect. It captured the formless, existential dread of the thing Arthur had shown me. A predator that hunted not flesh, but meaning. I sat at the small wooden table, the journal open before me, my phone's dying flashlight casting a pool of nervous light on the page. The rest of the night passed in a feverish, obsessive blur. Sleep was impossible. Sleep felt like a luxury from a world I no longer lived in. I read. I devoured Arthur's life, his thoughts, his 40 years of solitary guardianship, page by page. The fear that had sent me scrambling up the ladder began to slowly, almost imperceptibly transmute into something else. Understanding. His work, I learned, had shifted dramatically after his first few encounters with the librarian. His initial purely scientific curiosity was replaced by a grim, urgent sense of duty. November 1991. The visions are a trap. The knowledge is a lure. I now believe the librarian is not just an archive, it is a distress beacon. Its song is a broadcast, a desperate plea for help, or a final testament shot into the void. But the signal that carries that knowledge is a dinner bell for the silence. It is drawn to these pockets of complex, coherent energy. My mission has changed. I am no longer an interpreter. I am a warden. I must build a cage of silence around this songbird, or its beautiful, tragic song will be the death of us all. Suddenly, the bizarre array of machinery on the workbench made a terrifying kind of sense. It wasn't just for listening. It was a shield. The copper coils, the signal jammers, the strange resonant frequency generators, it was all part of a homemade, jerry-rigged dampening field. A desperate attempt by one man to muffle a cosmic scream, to hide Earth's flickering candle from the hurricane blowing between the stars. And he hadn't been alone out here. His paranoia, which my family had dismissed as a symptom of his madness, was simple, rational observation. March 2003. They were here again. A black Chevy Suburban parked on the highway for hours. I watched them through the binoculars. 2 men in dark suits. They never got out. They just sat there, watching the shed. The same people who buried the initial geological survey 40 years ago. They don't know what's down there. Not really. They just know it's a power source of unimaginable magnitude. They are children poking a sleeping dragon with a stick, and I am the only one who knows it breathes fire. My family history was reframed in this new, tragic light. I found the tear-stained pages where he wrote about my grandmother leaving him, the heartbroken entries about my mother refusing to see me. May 1997. She called me a monster, a selfish old man who chose rocks and wires over his own family. How can I tell her the truth? How can I explain that I am standing a post on the loneliest wall in the universe to protect her, to protect this child I've never met? They see a madman who abandoned them. I see a sentry who cannot leave his post. The sacrifice must be everything. It has to be. I leaned back in the chair, the plastic groaning in the quiet. My grandfather wasn't a ghost. He was a hero. A lonely, tragic, brilliant hero who had sacrificed everything and no one had ever known. The weight of his solitude, of his secret, pressed down on me through the decades. The first rays of dawn began to bleed over the horizon, painting the eastern sky in pale shades of gray and lavender. The light crept across the salt flats, chasing away the long shadows. I watched the sunrise, but for the first time in my life, it brought no comfort. It only served to illuminate the harsh, stark reality of the world. A fragile, beautiful, noisy little world, blissfully unaware of the silent, patient predator that hunted the void. Arthur was gone. The warden was dead. The machinery on the workbench was 20 years old and coated in a fine layer of dust. The cage of silence was failing. His note hadn't just been a choice to know. It was an inheritance of duty, a job offer. The sentry had died and now his post was empty. My thoughts were a chaotic whirl of grief and a terrifying nascent sense of responsibility. As the sun crested the horizon, its light glinted off something far away on the black ribbon of the highway. I squinted, my sleep-deprived eyes struggling to focus. It was a vehicle, and it wasn't just passing by. It was turning onto the dirt track that led directly to me. I scrambled over to the workbench and rummaged through the clutter, my heart starting to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm. I found what I was looking for. A heavy, powerful pair of old military binoculars. I raised them to my eyes, my hand shaking as I adjusted the focus. The vehicle was a black SUV, modern, spotless, with tinted windows that reflected the sun's morning light like obsidian mirrors. It was kicking up a plume of white dust behind it, a purposeful, ominous arrow aimed directly at the heart of my grandfather's secret. The watchers were done watching. They were coming.
Panic is a cold, electric wave that floods your veins. For a moment I was frozen, a deer in the headlights, the binoculars shaking in my hands. The black SUV was still a mile out, but on the infinite white of the salt flats, it seemed much closer, as relentless as a shark cutting through water. They know. How could they know? Then it hit me. Of course they knew. They'd been watching for years. Arthur's death was a trigger. The old sentry had left his post. Now they were coming to finally claim the prize they'd been waiting for. "You have a choice," my grandfather had written, but the choice had vanished the moment I'd opened that hatch. I wasn't an heir anymore. I was an accomplice. My brain, exhausted from a sleepless night and overloaded with cosmic horror, suddenly kicked into a state of cold, desperate clarity. The hatch, the primary piece of evidence. It was right in the middle of the floor, as obvious as a wound. If they found it... I dropped the binoculars and scrambled through the shed like a caged animal. How do I hide it? What do I cover it with? There was nothing big enough or heavy enough. A rug? A tarp? It would be laughable. These men weren't idiots. My eyes darted around the workshop. The workbench. It was huge, cluttered with equipment and on heavy steel legs. Was it possible? I grabbed the edge of the bench. It weighed a ton. I strained the muscles in my back, screaming in protest. It screeched horribly, moving an inch across the concrete. It was hopeless. The SUV was twice as close now. I could see the sun glinting off its windshield. I dropped to my knees beside the hatch, my fingers tracing its perfectly machined seam. Could my grandfather, this brilliant, paranoid guardian, have no contingency for an invasion? Hadn't he planned for this? January 2011. They were back. Closer this time. They got out of the car and used binoculars. They're getting bolder. I've installed the final failsafe, the old illusion, a minor detail, easy to miss, but people see what they expect to see. Let them look. They will find only an old shed full of a madman's junk. The old illusion? What did he mean? I looked around desperately. My gaze snagged on something under the workbench. A low, long metal lever, almost hidden in the shadows, bolted to the floor. It wasn't connected to any of the equipment. It was just there. With no time to think, I scrambled over, gripped the cold metal, and pulled with all my might. There was a soft hiss of hydraulics from deep beneath the floor, then a series of quiet thumps. Before my eyes, a miracle happened. The paper-thin, perfect seam around the steel hatch began to fill with dust and fine grit, pushed up from within by unseen pistons. In seconds, the clean outline vanished, disguised as just another random crack in the old weathered concrete. It was brilliant. The hatch hadn't disappeared, but its obviousness had. It was now just another imperfection on an old floor. The SUV's engine cut out. They were here. I grabbed the journal from the table, shoved it deep into one of the crates of food, and buried it under cans of beans. Then I walked to the shed door and stood in the opening, forcing my breathing to steady, trying to look like a confused, tired, grieving granddaughter here to sort through her crazy grandfather's junk. Two men got out of the SUV. They weren't movie thugs. They wore simple khaki pants and dark polo shirts, short, professional haircuts, impenetrable sunglasses. They moved with the quiet, efficient confidence of men who are never questioned. The taller one, the one with a jawline that could cut glass, stepped forward. "Maya Collins?" His voice was calm, businesslike. It held no trace of a threat, which made it profoundly threatening. "Yes," I said, praying my voice wouldn't shake. "Who are you?" "We're from the Bureau of Land Management." He lied, the words effortless. "We're here about the property transfer. Standard procedure when a parcel of land like this changes hands. Your grandfather, he was a known quantity to us. We just need to ensure there are no unpermitted structures, or, shall we say, hazardous materials on site."
His gaze drifted past me into the gloom of the shed. Mind if we take a look inside? It wasn't a question. There was no choice. To deny them entry would be to pull the pin from a grenade. My only chance was to play the part I had set for myself. The dutiful, ignorant granddaughter, completely out of her depth. I forced a weary, tight-lipped smile. "I suppose," I said, my voice a little too high. "It's a mess. I haven't even started to go through his things." I stepped aside and they entered. They moved with a predatory grace that was completely at odds with their boring clothes. They split up immediately. The talker, the leader, moved slowly toward the workbench. The other one, who hadn't said a word, began a systematic sweep of the perimeter. He was methodical, his eyes missing nothing. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I stayed by the door, hugging my arms, trying to look small and unimportant. The silent agent's path took him directly across the center of the room, directly over the hatch. He walked over it. Then he stopped. He stood there for a long, agonizing second, his heavy work boots planted squarely on the disguised seam. He looked down. I swear I could feel the weight of his gaze pressing on the thin layer of dust and illusion my grandfather had engineered. My entire world shrank to that single spot on the floor. I forgot to breathe. The illusion had to hold. It had to. He scuffed his boot against the concrete, then glanced around the rest of the floor, as if comparing the textures. Then, with an almost imperceptible shrug, he moved on. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, a faint, shaky whisper of air. The illusion had held. "Quite the setup," the lead agent said from the workbench. He ran a gloved finger over the top of a dusty oscilloscope, leaving a clean streak. "Your grandfather was quite the hobbyist." He turned his head, his sunglasses fixing me with a blank, unreadable stare. Did he ever talk about his projects? What he was looking for out here? It was a test, a baited hook. "Honestly, I have no idea," I said, letting a genuine note of exhaustion and family bitterness creep into my voice. "My mother said he spent his last 40 years trying to listen to Russian military broadcasts or something equally crazy. He was convinced he was some kind of Cold War spy." I gave a short, sad laugh. We weren't close. He made his choices. The agent nodded slowly, as if accepting my story. But his eyes were still scanning the equipment, recognizing things, I was sure of it. He saw the reel-to-reel tape machine, the signal boosters, the custom-built antennas. He knew this wasn't an amateur radio setup. While he had my attention, I saw a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. The silent agent was by the small cot. He knelt down, pretending to inspect the frame. His hand darted out and picked up something from the floor by the table leg. Something small and dark that I hadn't even noticed. A rock. A little, oddly shaped, pitted black rock that Arthur must have used as a doorstop. But it wasn't a normal rock. I remembered a journal entry about a small fragment that had broken off the librarian during his excavation. The agent examined it for a split second in the palm of his hand, then, with a movement so slick it was almost invisible, he slipped it into his pocket. He stood up and gave his partner a nod, so subtle it was barely a gesture. They had found something. A piece of the truth. "Well, Miss Collins," the lead agent said, turning away from the workbench, "it seems everything is in order." He walked toward me, pulling a business card from his shirt pocket. "My name is Kane. If you find anything unusual while you're cleaning up, you give me a call." The card was plain white. It just said Kane, a phone number, and U.S. Department of Interior. Another lie. He paused in the doorway, putting his sunglasses back on. the bright desert light reflecting off the lenses. He said the next words in cold steel. "We'll be in touch about the final transfer of the deed. Don't go anywhere." Then they were gone. They got into their SUV, turned it around in a cloud of white dust, and drove away, a black speck disappearing back toward the highway. I stood in the doorway, shaking, watching until they were completely gone. The immediate danger was over, but I knew with chilling certainty that I wasn't alone. I was no longer just the inheritor of a secret. I was the guardian of a prison, and the wardens were watching. The moment the SUV was a memory on the horizon, I flew into action. There was no more room for shock or grief. Kane's parting words, "Don't go anywhere," weren't advice. They were a declaration. They had a sample. They would analyze it. Its impossible density and alien structure would set off alarm bells in whatever secret lab they operated. And they would be back. Not with questions, but with drills and cutting torches. My grandfather's final, desperate act of sacrifice had bought him 40 years. I had maybe 48 hours. My mission had become brutally, terrifyingly simple. I had to finish what Arthur started. I had to reinforce the cage. I ran to the workbench, my eyes scanning the chaotic but purposeful array of equipment. This was his life's work. A shield generator built from scavenged parts and sheer, lonely genius. But would it even work? Much of it was dark, coated in a fine layer of dust. I saw a main power breaker on a panel near the wall and flipped it. Nothing happened. Of course, the system wasn't powered from the grid. That would have been a vulnerability, a tether to the world he was hiding from. It had to be powered from the generator in the antechamber, 300 feet below. A cold dread washed over me. I had to go back down. I had to go back to the door of that chamber, to the source of my terror. There was no choice. Leaving the shield offline was a death sentence for the world. This time, the descent was different. The blind panic was gone, replaced by a cold, grim resolve. I knew what was down there. I knew the stakes. I was no longer a terrified victim of circumstance. I was a soldier, descending into a bunker to face an enemy. The antechamber was just as I'd left it, cold, silent, and menacing. The massive, circular door to the librarian's chamber loomed before me. I pointedly ignored it, turning my attention to the diesel generator. It looked ancient but well-maintained. A quick check of the fuel tank showed it was nearly full. Arthur had been prepared. I followed the thick, insulated cables from the generator to a breaker box on the wall. Inside was a large, heavy-duty switch labeled in my grandfather's neat handwriting, "Primary System Power." I took a deep breath and threw the switch. A deep, satisfying thunk echoed in the small room. A series of indicator lights on the panel flickered from red to green. Up above, I heard the faint, distant hum of the equipment in the shed coming to life. I climbed the ladder again, my muscles burning, my mind racing. When I emerged back into the shed, it was transformed. It was no longer a dusty tomb. It was a living machine. The vacuum tubes on the oscilloscopes glowed with a soft orange light. The reel-to-reel tape machine began to slowly, silently turn. A low, powerful hum filled the air. A hum of human technology, now pushing back against the cosmic hum from below. I rushed to the workbench. I didn't understand the complex physics behind it, but I understood the goal. I found a central console with a large, circular screen, like an old radar display. As it warmed up, a faint, chaotic pattern of static began to resolve into a coherent image. It was a topographical map of the energy field. At the center was a blindingly bright, pulsating point of light, the librarian. Surrounding it was a faint, flickering, and dangerously thin shell of green energy, Arthur's shield. On the edge of the screen, a new series of red indicators were blinking. They were labeled with compass directions. It was a proximity alert. They hadn't just been watching. They had surrounded this place with sensors. October 2014. The shield is weakening. The power consumption is immense. I have to constantly adjust the frequency modulators to keep the resonance cage stable. It is like trying to cup water in your hands. The signal always wants to leak out. I'm old. My hands are not as steady as they once were. I fear I can no longer hold the water. I fear the song will escape. He couldn't do it alone anymore. Now it was my turn. I looked at the controls. Dials labeled resonance frequency, field amplitude, harmonic modulation. It was a language I didn't speak, but next to the console was a stool. And on that stool was another smaller, spiral-bound notebook. It wasn't a journal. It was an instruction manual. Decades of calculations, observations, and procedures all boiled down to a single purpose: how to fly the machine that kept the world safe. I grabbed the manual, my eyes scanning the first page. Shield startup sequence. My hands flew across the console, turning dials, flipping switches, my movements guided by the ghost of my grandfather. With each adjustment, the flickering green shell on the screen grew brighter, stronger, more stable. The chaotic noise of the system settled into a smooth, powerful hum. I was doing it. I was reinforcing the cage. And then I saw it. A new icon appeared on the edge of the display. A single blinking red dot moving slowly but purposefully along the dirt track from the highway. They were back. And this time, they weren't in an SUV. The icon was labeled by the system's rudimentary threat analysis software. The label was simple, and it made my blood run cold. Drilling platform. Drilling platform. The two words on the screen were a death sentence. My blood ran cold. This was the end game. They weren't coming to talk. They weren't coming to inspect. They were coming to break the vault. The thought of that crude, brutal drill tearing into the sacred ancient chamber, into the librarian itself, filled me with a fury that burned away my fear. This was no longer just about protecting the world. It was about defending something holy. They would be here in minutes. The ground was already beginning to tremble with the platform's approach. I couldn't fight them. I couldn't reason with them. What could I do? My eyes fell on the instruction manual, still open on the console. I ripped through the final pages, my fingers flying, searching for a miracle. And I found it. The last chapter. It wasn't a startup or maintenance guide. The page was bordered in red, the title written in Arthur's block capitals. Contingency Protocol. Resonance Cascade. Last resort only. Journal entry. Read in a voiceover, Arthur's voice grave and filled with warning. If they ever try to breach the primary chamber, hiding the signal is no longer enough. The librarian cannot be allowed to fall into their hands, nor can it be destroyed. This protocol is the only other option. It is not a shield, it is a weapon, not of destruction, but of revelation. By overloading the dampening field with a precise harmonic frequency, we can force the librarian to release a directed, wideband psychic burst. A single, raw, undiluted scream of pure knowledge. It will not harm them physically, but it will show them. It will show them everything. The beauty, the history, and the horror of the Great Silence. No sane mind can witness that and continue the mission. But the feedback could be catastrophic. It could destroy the operator's mind. It is a weapon that fires in both directions. May God forgive me for creating it, and may God forgive you if you ever have to use it. The rumbling outside grew to a deafening roar and then stopped. Bright, intrusive floodlights suddenly illuminated the shed, casting stark geometric shadows inside. They were here. I looked at the screen. The drilling platform icon was stationary, blinking malevolently directly on top of my position. I could hear the clang of metal, the barked orders of men setting up. My time was up. I turned to the resonance cascade procedure in the manual. It was a complex, terrifying sequence of commands that had to be entered perfectly. My hands, slick with sweat, flew across the console. Power to auxiliary capacitors, check. Deactivate primary safety interlocks, check. Inputting the final frequency modulation, a string of numbers so long it looked like an astronomical calculation. I typed it in, my heart hammering with each keystroke. Outside, I heard the high-pitched whine of the drill spinning up. The final step. A single, large, safety-covered red button on the console, labeled Cascade. I slammed my hand down, flipping the cover open. I watched the screen. The drill icon began to flash, indicating its energy signature was increasing. They were starting. I took one last look at the dusty, beautiful, terrible machine my grandfather had built. I understand, Grandpa. I'll watch the wall. And I pressed the button. There was no sound, no explosion. The hum from the machinery simply stopped. For a single, terrifying second, the world went completely silent. And then the wave hit. It was a silent scream that tore through my mind. Even filtered through the console, the feedback was agonizing. I saw it all again, the city of light, the billion-year life of a star, the fractal beauty of the universe, and then the all-consuming, unmaking void of the great silence, 100 times more vivid and horrifying than before. I screamed, clutching my head, collapsing against the console, the raw data threatening to tear my sanity to shreds. And then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The silence that followed was absolute. Shaking, I pulled myself up and looked at the screen. A new camera feed from an external sensor Arthur had installed was now active. On it, I saw the scene outside. The drilling platform stood silent, its drill bit frozen inches from the ground. Kane and his men were scattered on the salt flats. Some were on their hands and knees vomiting, others were curled in a fetal position shaking. Kane himself was standing stiffly, his sunglasses gone, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to have hollowed him out. He was staring into the distance at the stars that were invisible in the daylight, seeing the monster that lived between them. Slowly, like broken automatons, they began to stir. They didn't look at the shed. They didn't look at each other. They stumbled back to their vehicles, their professional arrogance shattered, replaced by the primal fear of a child who has just seen the monster in the closet is real. In 5 minutes, they were gone. They would not be back. The secret was safe. The sun was setting, painting the salt flats in hues of orange and deep purple. I shut down the cascade protocol and re-engaged the shield. On the screen, the green bubble around the librarian's signal was bright, stable, and strong. I walked to the door of the shed and leaned against the frame, my body aching, my mind bruised but intact. I was alone, the sole guardian of the greatest secret in human history, the inheritor of a sacred, terrifying duty. My old life was a ghost, as distant as the dead civilization that had sent its last message to this quiet, lonely world. I looked out at the vast, empty desert, the first stars of evening beginning to appear in the darkening sky. It was no longer a wasteland to me. It was my post. It was my home. And I would keep the watch.